If you visit the Great North Museum, Hancock in Newcastle, you can come across two altars that were once dropped into the river by the Romans when they occupied the site, and they are altars to Neptune and Oceanus. So why on earth would people be dropping altars into the River Tyne? What did they think they were trying to achieve? And why on earth were they worshipping Neptune and Oceanus? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. It is the 1st of May, so first of all, this year has gone ridiculously quickly, and happy May Day if you are celebrating today. I didn't actually want to do an episode on May Day because I thought that might be a little bit weird if someone comes across this in like October, but there we go. If anyone does want one at some point in the future, obviously please do just give us a shout. Now, we are looking this month at Roman gods in Britain, and you might be wondering why, and I thought, why not? Because it is quite interesting to see how the Romans sort of adapted some of their deities to match what the British people were doing at the time, and obviously they would be worshipping a lot of Celtic deities, so they actually brought gods with them, but then also just adopted local ones. So I just thought that was quite cool, and that's what we're going to be having a look at this month. And we are going to start off with two gods in my hometown of Newcastle upon Tyne, because it is quite nice for me to be able to use my own photos in blog posts, because obviously copyright, but it just gives a greater sense of connection to the site and what I'm looking at and all that kind of jazz. So in 2018, and I did actually have to check when I took these photos, I did find two altars in the Great North Museum, Hancock, which is fantastic. If you ever come to Newcastle, highly recommend visiting. And I'm not being paid to say that because it's free to get in, but definitely go back when everything's reopened. And they've got these two altars, and therefore Neptune and Oceanus. And essentially, they were discovered in 1872 when they were busy building the swing bridge that crosses the Tyne. And essentially, people then found the site of the Roman bridge Ponzilius, and these two altars were found in the River Tyne, right at the spot where the Roman bridge crossed the river. Now, I should point out as well, Ponzilius was the only bridge outside of Rome named after an emperor, because the Romans did actually understand how important Newcastle was to the northern edge of their empire. So one of the altars bears a fish wrapped around a trident, and that is dedicated to the god Neptune, and the other one is an anchor, which is dedicated to Oceanus. Now, both altars were dedicated by the 6th Legion, and some people think that they stood either side of the bridge, and then scholars believe that the altars were dropped into the water as part of a dedication ceremony, which would explain the location in the mud of the river, which did help to preserve them. So let's find out a little bit more about them. So Hadrian actually visited Britain in 122 AD, and he very quickly realised his outpost needed a northern frontier wall. So a fort at Newcastle guarded the eastern end of the wall, and initially Ponzilius only referred to the bridge that crossed the Tyne, and then after a while the name came to refer to the fort as well. Now Ponzilius just literally means the alien bridge, which is after Hadrian's family name. And eventually they ended up extending the wall out to Segedinum, which is now Wallsend. And that is just literally how literal Geordies are of, the wall ends here, what should we call it? Wallsend. I just love that. But anyway, the castle keep, which was built in 1167, actually stands on the site of the original encampment. And there's a pretty steep slope that leads down from the castle down to where the bridge was, and if you've ever tried to power walk up either Dean Street or the side, you will know how steep that slope is. And yes, that is another example of literal place naming. In Newcastle, there is a street called the Side because it goes up the side of the castle keep. We'll like to keep things as straightforward as possible up here. But basically, the castle's on that site for defensive purposes. So if your main goal is defence, then why not get the gods on your side as well? So it's unsurprising that the Romans would have chosen water-based gods for their new fort, because so much about the city relates to water. I mean, even now we use seahorses as a common emblem. Neptune still lurks on the quayside, standing on the parapet of the old fish market, which is now a gig venue, very imaginatively called the Riverside. And as the god of fresh water in the sea, Neptune is often twinned with his Greek counterpart Poseidon. Now, scholars do sometimes argue about Neptune's provenance, but plenty of inscriptions originally mention him near springs, lakes and rivers, and his role guarding the sea may actually be a later addition. It is, however, interesting to note that Neptune didn't occupy the same position of power as his Greek counterpart Poseidon. Now, Poseidon was always part of the Greek pantheon, and some saw him as Zeus's second in command, which I'm sure probably really annoyed Hera, which was Zeus's wife. In Roman myth, Neptune's brothers are Jupiter and Pluto, which is Zeus and Hades in ancient Greece. But the funny thing is, in Roman mythology, he doesn't actually appear in either of the classic triads. So you've got the archaic triad, which is Jupiter, Mars and Quirinus, who was basically the deification of Rome's founder Romulus. And you've got the Capitoline triad, which is Jupiter, Juno and Minerva. So basically, either way, Neptune didn't hold the same level of influence within the Roman pantheon. Now, Neptune only had one major festival, the Neptunalia, which was held at the end of July, and they basically used this festival to plead for rains during the hottest part of the year in the Mediterranean. Now, that's not to say that he wasn't important, because clearly anyone who worked on or near the sea would leave offerings for him, and he did become more important as the Roman Empire spread throughout the Mediterranean, because obviously the more of a coastline you have, the more emphasis you're going to put on sea-based gods. Now, Thomas Apel actually points out that until the 1st century BCE, Roman admirals actually gave the credit for their naval victories to Fortunus, a god of luck, not Neptune. But by the time the Romans reached Britain, Neptune had finally found his place as a deity. Now, he's always pictured with the trident, which obviously you do sort of see a bit of a version of in The Little Mermaid, the Disney version, because of the fact that King Triton obviously has the trident, and in some places people believe that Triton is actually based on Neptune's son, also called Triton. But Neptune's other symbols also include the horse, the dolphin and the bull. He was the god of horses and storms as well as the sea, so Neptune could sink ships by summoning mighty storms. He's usually characterised as a somewhat tempestuous figure, and he was somewhat capricious, but he also had a sense of what was rightfully his, and you could to an extent possibly call it like a sense of fair play, because in one myth Neptune aided Laomedon in building the city of Troy, and the king refused to pay Neptune for his help, so Neptune then sent floods throughout the lands, and Neptune even dispatched a sea monster to the city. And I don't know why he didn't just simply pay him, but Laomedon eventually offered his daughter Hesione as a sacrifice, and Hercules had to turn up to kill the monster and save Hesione instead. And in the Aeneid by Virgil, the hero Aeneas battles to find a safe harbour in a furious storm. Now the problem is, Juno, who's the goddess queen and wife of Jupiter, has sent this storm. But in doing so, she's essentially overstepped the boundaries, because obviously the sea's Neptune's domain, not hers, and she's essentially taken the mick a little bit, shall we say. Neptune's totally furious at her complete disregard for his domain, and quite frankly, I think rightfully so. So to annoy her even further, he then calms the seas down so Aeneas can pass. Neptune did fall out of favour following the growth of Christianity, because he just wasn't really able to make the leap, unlike goddesses like Fortuna and Justitia, who became Lady Luck and Lady Justice respectively. So it is quite interesting when you do see sort of Lady Justice outside court buildings and so on. That's basically a Roman goddess, but never mind. Now, that's not to say that Neptune entirely lost his influence, because Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Rowe do report that fishermen continued to honour Neptune. They would cut a slit in a cork float attached to their net and then push a coin into this, and this was apparently their way of telling Neptune that they would buy any fish they caught. Now, what's really odd is the fact that despite this altar that was then dropped into the Tyne, dedicated to Neptune, probably to either thank him for help in defence or for something to do with fishing out at sea, because remember Newcastle was a port, there's not really a huge amount of evidence beyond that to show any worship of Neptune. There is some evidence elsewhere in the country, and there is a bearded mask, I think, in Bath, which is believed to represent Neptune, because you often see him as this bearded figure, perhaps sometimes even with seaweed on him and so on. So it's quite interesting that there's an altar to him and very little else. But again, if you're going to try and get someone on your good side and you live on a river, Neptune's quite a good one to go for. But don't forget, they didn't just have an altar to Neptune, they also had one to Oceanus. So who's Oceanus, you might be asking? Well, he's also a god of the sea, in a way. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing, because you generally find Oceanus a little bit more often actually in Greek mythology. And he's one of the Titans. And in Greek mythology, you basically have the Titans who come first, basically. And then you've got the Olympians, who are the next gods who defeat the Titans in this massive war that goes on for ages. And Oceanus essentially is one of the Titans, and he personifies the sea. So the Titans tend to actually personify things, whereas the Olympians are gods of stuff instead. Now, Oceanus was also the god of fresh water, and he's a somewhat primordial figure in a lot of ways, and he's credited by Homer as being the original father of all things. Now, sometimes the depictions of him make him sound quite terrifying, because he's often seen as either being half man and half serpent, and I have actually seen Greek vases before which have got Oceanus on them, and he's got the top half of a man and then this serpent's tail. He's often given quite wild hair and the horns of a bull, and as I say, he sounds quite terrifying, but he was actually believed to be one of the more temperate of the gods. And Charles Mills Gailey actually describes Oceanus's palace as, and I quote, "beyond the limits of the bountiful earth, surrounded by gardens and all things fair," end quote. He's often considered to be quite gentle, quite aloof, and basically less interested in the world than the other gods. So generally a god that you'd kind of want to get on the good side of, but also one who isn't going to be quite as scary or likely to suddenly kick off about something as Neptune. He was the son of Uranus and Terra, and him and his sister wife Tethys produced the river gods and ocean nymphs. And obviously we did cover the ocean nymphs ages ago, back in 2019 when we did water mythology. Oceanus often appears as a physical body of water in myths, but then when he does appear in human form, it's as the father of rivers and streams. And in one of the Greek myths, his daughter is actually the river Styx, which you'd recognise from our Charon episode when we did about the Greek ferrymen. But it's quite interesting because Martin Hennig actually explains that Oceanus appears as the great river encircling the world, and beyond it lay, and I quote, "nothing except the chill and sombre realm of the dead," end quote. So basically, if you've built a fort beside an important river, who better to appeal to than Oceanus, who's essentially the father of all rivers and also embodies the river that acts as his boundary of the known world. And if you look at the Roman gods family tree, Neptune is actually Oceanus's nephew, because Neptune's father is Saturn, brother to Oceanus. So why would you choose two Roman gods for essentially the same thing? Now, Gailey believes that Oceanus rules the sea as head of the older dynasty, while Neptune rules as part of the younger dynasty. So if you wanted to hedge your bets, making offerings to both of them would essentially ensure that you appeased the river one way or the other. And also it should be noted that both gods do present different aspects. And Oceanus remained neutral in the War of the Titans, he just wanted nothing to do with it, which is one of the reasons why he then survives into the era of the Olympians. And there's one myth where Juno actually appeals to Oceanus and Tethys during a spat with her husband Jupiter. And as an arbiter, Oceanus basically appears quite fair and peaceful. He's quite level-headed and essentially avoids conflict and prefers diplomacy. Neptune, on the other hand, represented the chaotic and somewhat unpredictable power of the sea. There's quite a few myths where he challenges the other gods in contests, and he's also the deity who raped Medusa, leading to her transformation into a Gorgon. So ultimately, having altars to both of them may help you to appeal to both calm sailing and raw power, which quite frankly would come in quite handy when defending a riverside fort. It's just a pity that we don't have more information about how they were worshipped beyond these altars being dropped into the river, but it is quite good that they did find the altar, so at least they can start to investigate how the Romans did worship their deities while they were on British soil. So I thought that was quite interesting. It would be quite cool if you let me know which Roman gods appear where you are, because obviously every local area, particularly in Britain, does have like their own version of the Roman gods, because they were often linked with the local Celtic gods. So you find quite a lot of versions of Mars where it's like a double barrel name of Mars something, where he's been linked with the local Celtic god that did the same thing. So if you do have any of those, do let me know, and that would be really cool. Next week we're going to have a look at a slightly different kind of Roman god, because he's sort of a Roman god who's adopted from elsewhere, which they were quite fond of doing, and that's Mithras. So we're going to go and meet Mithras next week, so I hope you enjoy that. And then after that we're going to do Mars and Jupiter. So also, in my opinion, like the two best bits of Holt's Planet Suites, but that's a complete side issue. So that's basically that for this week. I hope you have a marvellous week ahead with whatever it is that May throws at you. Obviously, as always, if you want to support the podcast, you can leave me a review if you'd like to support me for free. That is really helpful. It basically helps to beat the algorithm and lets people know that it's worth listening to, so that's nice. You can tell a friend, and that's also really helpful, so that you can support the podcast for free by doing either of those things. Sharing is caring. Or obviously, if you do want to support financially, which does cover costs and all that kind of jazz, then you can either buy me a coffee, which is like £3 or something, and like, to be fair, that goes on books. You can support through PayPal and make a donation, or you can become a regular supporter on Patreon, where you will get extra bonus content and whatnot as well. So whatever it is that you choose to do, thank you, and I hope you have a lovely week ahead, and I'll see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.